Hello, everyone, and welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. Today's program, Art Communities, is the fifth in a series of talks in conjunction with the exhibition Art Along the Rivers, a Bicentennial Celebration, which is now on view at the museum. For this installment, we are joined by Melissa Wolf, Curator of American Art, who will talk about the fourth thematic section in the exhibition. Thanks for being here today, Melissa.
Thank you, Jessica. So I am so glad to be here today to talk about the fourth section. So I'm hoping that many of you have been following along in the earlier three sections and that you will come again next week for the last section. So this exhibition, let's see, there we go. So this exhibition, as many of you may have, already said, is in conjunction with the bicentennial, with the Missouri State Bicentennial. But in thinking about this, we wanted to do something a little closer to home. And also to think a little outside of the box of bicentennialness. So this show instead goes back 1,000 years instead of 200 years, and it focuses on this region, which you see the maps here called that Amy Torbert, my co-curator, and I have called the Confluence region. And it is, we call it that because it is very much shaped by being this area in which the three most powerful rivers in North America all meet, and that's the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Ohio. And it meets in a very small space. So this is a really condensed, powerful area in the history of North America. And so we decided to focus on that. It's also the area where, most of us listening to this, maybe not all, hopefully not all, this is where we walk. This is where we live. We cross the same land and see some of the same things that a Mississippian resident would have seen 1,000 years ago. And to me, that's a very powerful thing. Or someone 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago. We share this space, we share this land. And so that's sort of at the heart of this exhibition. In thinking about the exhibition, we decided rather than to go chronological, which didn't seem as fresh or as inviting in thinking about this area, as thematic. And so we selected 5 themes. And you see them here. The exhibition begins with Art at the Confluence, which looks at the way in which the art history of this area was shaped by being at the confluence, the artists passing through, creating works, the communities that came here to stay because of this confluence. Then Art on Display looked at the art that you could have seen in this area in the long 19th century, sort of leading or accumulating in the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Art in Production looked at works in this area that were meant to be sold or meant to sell something, whether it's an object commercially or an idea. And that looked at the objects in terms of their natural history, their materials, from this area. Then art communities, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And that is the communities that formed in this area. And then next week, Amy will talk about art as advocate, and that is art that advocates for a particular idea or community. So if we're going to look at this section right here, we are also then going to put it into 7 areas. So sort of putting boxes into boxes into boxes, right? To make it more understandable. So we're going to look at 7 different communities, and one which we've titled Folk and Outsider Art. And we look at that because while there were artists who sought to gather together into communities in order to be inspired and to bounce off of each other or to work in alliance with each other, there are also artists who work outside of that. So we didn't want to suggest that this is like the way in which the best art is created, because it's not. So the folk and outsider artists are artists who had the same compulsion to create as artists who were trained, who worked in communities, either academically trained or otherwise. And so these artists are the ones who act on that, regardless of what material they have or what training they have, because that is at the heart of really this entire exhibition. So let's just start right away. The first section we look at is the University City ceramics. And this was a very short-lived entity in University City, which is, it gets its name. And it was created, here you see the artists who were here. It was created by an entrepreneur, actually, Edward G. Lewis, who was a magazine, who had created a magazine empire, actually, that was focused on women's readership. And so as sort of growing this entity, he decided to create an American Women's League, which was really a league nationally. You had a membership to advocate for women's suffrage, for other women's issues as well. And then he also decided to start a correspondence school, which correspondence schools were very, very popular at the end of the 19th century for women, because of course they weren't going to academic schools necessarily, or it would make it easier for them to learn certain areas that would be approved, that would be okay for women. So for instance, China painting or ceramics, which were, something that you could sort of do and still be considered appropriate for women. So Lewis was building his center for his American Women's League in University City, and actually the City Hall that we all know because of its circular shape, that was actually the one building that he got built, which was the center for that originally. So he adds a pottery, and so he decides to bring really the four most renowned artists working in the field of ceramics in the Western world. One was Taxile Duat, and he had been one of the highest paid and most respected artists working in Sèvres in France. He brought Adelaide Robineau, who was an American who had really gained one of the most national reputations for both her technique, but also for Ceramics, which was a magazine that she and her husband published, which was about ceramics. Frederick Reed, who had emigrated to the United States from England, and his family had worked for many, many years in the Staffordshire area of ceramics in England. And then Catherine Cherry, and Cherry was also a St. Louis artist, but she had gotten a reputation for China painting. And so this entity, this University City Ceramics, actually only lasted from 1909 to 1914. So it was very short-lived. Lewis might have been known for his big ideas and for creating this empire. He was not known so well for managing things, and so it did not last very long. But in those short 4 years when it lasted, it did it is now thought of as the most original arts and crafts sort of groups of potteries in the United States. And so we can sort of take a look at why here. So these are the three works that we include from University Ceramics in the exhibition. And the work on the very right was made by Taxile Duat, and it is his gourd vase. So Duat was known for his glazes, particularly for innovating crystalline glazes, and this particular work has a crystalline glaze that has titanium put into it. And so when it's fired at very high temperatures, these metals create, titanium creates a sort of metallic, but yet it's matte. It's a very interesting, it's just an absolutely sort of unique and interesting surface. And while it looks sort of smooth here, in fact, that surface is sort of gourd-like. It's got some you can't even see my hands. It's hard to explain without your hands, isn't it? But it's very gourd-like, sort of the sort of the movement of its surface. And then these crystalline glazes also create these incredible blues and greens. And so, and this comes in some ways from Japanese pottery being interested in gourd shapes and natural vegetal shapes. And then to the left, the work on the left is Frederick Hurton Reed. And he's known very much, and I think this is an exemplar of his mixing of Art Nouveau forms and arts and crafts forms. So for instance, this beautiful sway of the trunks and the branches of the trees and their rhythmic repetition across the surface, and particularly the limbs, how they curl around each other. It's just an incredible Art Nouveau feel to it. And yet sort of the regularity, sort of checker pattern that's around the top, and that beautiful rich matte glaze with the incised lines is yet also very arts and crafts in its style. And then I saved the middle for the last. This is a work called the Scarab Vase, which was created by Adelaide Robineau. And Robineau is known, and I'll just give you a little detail of it so we can see, for these absolutely intricate sort of technique defying surfaces. So she used, in order to incise out the center medallion and the other elements, and you'll see in its stand in the full picture on the right, it's actually incised all the way out very delicately. She uses this tiny little needle-like tool that she would very, very carefully incise out just to the very surface, not punctuating it. And in fact, when Amy and I were with the installation team putting this in, there was a courier from the Everson Museum who came with it to make sure that it was installed. And she said, okay, now the curator tells me we have to do this. And so she took a flashlight and put it down into the vase, and you could see the light sort of glow through these really fine, thin areas that she's left inside the incised vase. And then also this beautiful repetition of scarab forms on it. And then it's all hand glazed. So this took about 1,000 hours to create. And she actually had created another scarab vase and also a turtle vase, neither of which made it through the kiln, made it through the firing procedure, because these are very fragile in terms of firing them. So just this technical tour de force that is known as really one of the most important ceramic works made in the United States. And then our second group that we're going to talk about is the St. Genevieve Artist Colony. And while many groups from St. Louis had gone to Provincetown for the summer art colony there, with the height of the Great Depression in the 1930s, that became economically difficult to do. And so a group of 3 artists, and you see 2 of them here on the left, Jessie Beard Rickley, and Amy Schweig, but also Bernard Peters, had sort of traveled around to look for a closer place. And they found the perfect place in St. Genevieve, which is just south of St. Louis, along the Mississippi River. And here you see, so they began going down into St. Genevieve in 1932. In 34, they create a summer art school, actually. And so here you see a class. It was very sort of much based on the Provincetown model, where, students would listen to lectures and then they would go work, and then they would come back and sort of critique each other's works. It was very communal, very sort of utopian, and maybe a little progressive in its ideas. It was not about a particular style. And we'll see that when we look at these 2 works, very, very different styles of works by Peters and Schweig. However, they are both still sort of American scene works, and that is sort of going out around the world that and painting these sort of local scenes, local entities and communities. And so Bernard Peters was sort of a loner, and he had moved into a cabin about 10 miles outside of St. Genevieve. And so this is that beautiful Missouri Ozark landscape. You feel the summer heat and the humidity and this lush greenness. I always feel like my allergies sort of pop up whenever I look at this painting, but incredible rich brushwork, beautiful impastos. And that is in comparison really to Amy Schweig's work, which is lime works in St. Genevieve. And this does depict the lime works, which is still, but certainly was in the 30s, the major industry in that St. Genevieve area. Almost would call this a work of precisionism, which was a style in the United States at the time. Clean shapes, everything reduced to its geometric form, cool tonalities, cool colors. While this was painted in 1936, um, only 2 years later in 38, the lime works had a massive strike. 400 workers walked out. It stymied the railroad workers who then had no jobs, and it really created this immense tension in the neighborhood. And that was sort of a hit to the St. Genevieve Artist Colony. Oh, sorry. But it was also the entry into World War II that sort of ended it, for good. But while it lasted, it was incredibly supportive, particularly to women artists. In fact, it was, begun by 2 women artists, and really created this wonderful sense of community for the artists who traveled there in the summer. Another group that we're going to look at, or that we included in the show, are works that were made as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal during the Depression, his attempt to get people working and the economy restarted. And as part of those New Deal projects, there was the Works Progress Administration, which funded many artists to work, getting them back onto work. But there was also the Federal Art Project, which maybe isn't as well known as the WPA, but it was one of its programs to focus on artists. And the first FAP, is what you would call it, program that started in St. Louis was a project called the Index of American Design. I'm so sorry, that went out of my head for a moment. And the Index of American Design was a project to document early American objects as a way to identify an American art history that was separate from its art history, tied in style to Europe. Now, of course, these are inevitably European derived forms, some not, but it is looking at those works to trace an American art history to its own roots in the United States. And so beautiful, amazing works in watercolor, a series. These are now owned by the National Gallery of Art, all of the works, but there were a number of them of Missouri art objects and by Missouri artists. So these are Missouri artists. And Dolores Haupt is a Missouri artist. However, this work, which is in the exhibition, is not only a Missouri artist, Haupt, but also a Missouri object. So this is a bag that were very popular in the antebellum era. So as women in the 1850s began to go out into public more readily without being necessarily chaperoned, they needed a bag to carry their calling cards or bits of change. And so these bags began to become very popular. They were often made by the women, so they sort of showed off their artistic skills. And this particular bag, this particular bag was made by the grandmother of a St. Louis resident, Antoinette Pearson Taylor, probably made in the 1850s, and it was painted by Dolores Haupt. So, and what's amazing about this, I think, is that when you look at it, and in fact, there isn't a tape in front of this work, so you can get up really close and look at this in the exhibition. Every single little bead and frayed thread, you see that on the tie and on the ends and little gaps, because it is an older work, right, is depicted so carefully and so amazingly. And what I find amazing, so there was a newspaper article about this project, and you see some of the other works. I hope you recognize some. For instance, that coat is a Robert Campbell coat that you see, and also another bag up in the left-hand side there. But you see a photo of Dolores Haupt, and Amy and I were so surprised. Amy did a lot of research on this particular artist, that she really sort of shows up for this, and she's an amazing watercolorist, and then we don't really hear much from her again after that. So it's amazing the sort of talent that was here that sometimes doesn't hit the archive records in ways that we would expect. And that was one of the really great things of this exhibition, is to sort of find. The WPA and FAP also had an easel program that's probably more well-known maybe. And one of the artists on that easel program from St. Louis was Joseph Worst, who was a German immigrant. And he was drawn more to the hardships that were being experienced in the 1930s. And this is common. I mean, coming out of the early 20th century, when artists were pushed to go back to where they were from and paint the world they knew and the communities they knew and the world around them. Well, when the Great Depression hit and the Dust Bowl hit, those artists were already focused on this world around them. And so they became focused on the people's and their world and their hardship because of the economic and environmental stresses of this era. So this particular work is called After the Flood, and it comes out of his experience and this area's experience actually of a winter flood in 1937. It's often known of as the Ohio and Mississippi Valley flood. As I said, it happened in the winter, and you see that in this painting with the snow and the cracked earth and the cold. The mother holds her child, wrapping her as best she can. And it was a flood of incredible hardship. It inundated, and you see that, I hope, from this map. 27,000 square miles were inundated in water, and that traveled, as you see, over 12 states. So it was this massive national tragedy and hardship. And in fact, it really expanded the ability of the Red Cross to meet these kinds of needs. At one point, the Mississippi River spread 60 miles wide, and it left 1 million people homeless. So Forrest is looking at the effect it had on this particular area. Another artist, well, and here you see some images from this area that were taken, so sort of near the crest. It did crest down near where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi River. But another artist who was it took images as a lingering result of this flood is Arthur Rothstein. And so another one of these FSA, or one of these New Deal programs, was the Farm Security Administration documentary project. And so the Farm Security Administration both wanted to document the effects in the across rural areas of the Great Depression, and also to document their programs that made those hardships better. So they were sort of documenting why they should continue to be funded, these support programs and assistance programs. And so one of the most well-known photographers who was hired by the FSA was Arthur Rothstein. And he was in the area sort of around Sikeston, actually documenting a different FSA program, but a strike, or not a strike, but a demonstration was organized along highways 60 and 61 outside of Sikeston. And so he went over to document this demonstration. And what this demonstration is, it was evicted sharecroppers. So after the flood in 37, the federal government gave aid to those farmers whose land had been inundated by floods. And in this area, there was mostly sharecropping. So there's a difference between tenement farmers and sharecropping. Tenement farmers rented the land, and the profit or loss was theirs to bear. Sharecroppers, however, made a contract with the owner of the land to work the land. They didn't have to pay rent, but they did have to share a percentage of their loss or their gain. And so with these federal programs, the money was going directly to the landowners, and then the landowners were deciding how to distribute that land to the sharecroppers. So the federal government had changed that ruling in 38 actually, so that the money then would go to the sharecroppers. And so the owners, instead of wanting that to happen, then just evicted sharecroppers, and they were going to switch to tenement farming, so they would still get the relief money and be able to control that. So these sharecroppers were evicted essentially because of the effects of this 1937 flood. So this was a demonstration, but it was a very well thought out demonstration. So it gained national attention. President Roosevelt, and particularly Eleanor Roosevelt, it gained their attention, lots of media coverage. In the end, it didn't really change very much, but it did get attention to this area. And one of the photos that Rothstein took that's in the exhibition is of this little boy. And this is where Rothstein is just such an amazing photographer, because rather than many of those big scenes, he gets up close and he shows the human element, which of course creates empathy for this community. And so the little boy has his head, his hat covered over his eyes. He's sort of pulled together, a little cold. He's sort of totally inward, and the detritus of where he's trying to live right is around him. So this incredible composition that creates empathy for him. This focus, as I said, on the element. The other program that comes out of the WPA, but we look at it as one of these communities, is the People's Art Center. So the WPA created art centers across the nation. In fact, they created 107. And these were art centers that were free to the population. So the WPA funded the funded the directors, it funded the art classes and the teachers' salaries. They did exhibitions. So it was a way to create free classes for the communities. And the St. Louis People's Art Center was particularly, I think, notable because it was the first interracial art center that was created in St. Louis in the time when the city was predominantly segregated. It had actually started before the WPA, ideas about creating the center, and then with the WPA, it was actually able to happen. So the People's Art Center opens in 1942. It is funded by the WPA until the WPA closes shop. And then because of the support for it, it is funded by local philanthropy, essentially, until 1967. And it starts to fail, gaining support. It also, there are some racial tensions in the city itself, but also among the board. And so it does stop. But while it was open in its peak years, it served over 2,000 students, adults and children in its classes. And the teachers had a very high level of teaching at these classes. And you see here two of those teachers, Frederick Alston and Houston Chandler. So Alston was the first art director and cartoonist for the St. Louis American. And he also taught at the People's Art Center. So the Art Center then, I mean, he already has a job in the arts field, but one of the things that the People's Art Center did was to increase the visibility of African American artists. There was the Urban League's exhibitions at the St. Louis Art Museum. Here, there were annual exhibitions, but it just increased the African American artists. It gave them more exhibition opportunities. It gave them training, particularly the adult students. And it also then garnered attention nationally. So for instance, Alston's painting was included in a national exhibition that was funded by the Harmon Foundation, which was also a foundation that supported African-American artists nationally. So the show opened in Washington, D.C., and then actually came to St. Louis, but this was his submission to that exhibition. Houston Chandler also was very high level. He taught in the high schools, Vashon. He was known locally as much for his track record. He was a St. Louisan, native St. Louisan, and also then for his coaching football and track. He's in the Track Hall of Fame, I think, for Missouri as well, but also for his art. He had gone to University of Iowa and gained his master's degree in studio art. In fact, he was the second African-American artist to do so at the University of Iowa. The first one was Elizabeth Catlett. And, you know, we just acquired an Elizabeth Catlett sculpture in wood in the past few years. And he knew Catlett. But you see this mastery of his, and I'll just give us another, well, I want to talk about Guerrilla first, with the reduction of form, this very modernist language, but the use, and this is very Catlett as well, sort of with this training, the use of the grain of the wood to enhance the sense of the musculature of this gorilla. And he's so crouched in, it's like the moment he's ready to spring. So on one hand, it's very simplified. On the other hand, it's also like full of energy. And here we see Chandler working while he's at the University of Iowa, and you see again this interest in this sort of modernist style and these simplified, rounded forms. So again, this really high level of teaching. Sort of coming out of the People's Art Center was another group called the Black Artists Group, often known as BAG. And here you see one of their early sort of membership or people who were active in it in 1969. So BAG forms in 1968, and it comes out of, well, and I should say it was more known for music actually when it began. Julius Hemphill, and you see him, let's see, 1, 2, 3, he is the third from the right. He's in a black turtleneck, and he was a jazz musician. And so it started out of the jazz movement, but more broadly, it started out of the jazz world in St. Louis. But nationally, it really comes out of a national call, part of the civil rights movement, part of an awareness of Black identity nationally. So it comes out of a national call for a sense of a Black identity and a sense of a Black history. And so, excuse me. So collectives form around the United States to address and to try to sustain and solidify and identify a Black perspective, a Black voice in national history, and a lineage of the arts, of Black arts to Africa as opposed to a European source. And so the Black artist group sort of come out of this. As I said, it begins as music, but it does then pull in all these different forms of creativity. And that is, I think, one of the ways in which it is remarkable in this larger Black arts movement is that it is so interdisciplinary, and many Black arts movement that come out of this larger movement are visual art. So they're very multimedia interests. Excuse me. But one of the things that forms them is sort of, or the shape that they take in their music and in their other arts is sort of based on three groundings. One is a European avant-garde, and I mean avant-garde, like Schoenhauer, the sort of whole tone composition, Arnold Schoenhauer, or John Cage, who's not European, but this sense of minimalism and rethinking how it is that art is, that music is composed. It comes out of that. It also comes out of this search for artistic forms that have their source in African art. And it also comes out of a kind of activist position, the concerns of their immediate neighborhood, which is on the north side of St. Louis. And in fact, their headquarters is located very close to the Pruitt-Igoe housing projects in this near north side that at the time was getting funds for development and urban development. So the Black Artist Group gets a grant that funds 5 artisan residencies. And so it is in music, visual art, theater, dance, and film. And so they have a visual art component. The artisan resident is Emilio Cruz, and his work you see here on the right. And Cruz was an Afro-Cuban, from Afro-Cuban descent, I should say, from New York City, and he comes out to St. Louis. And you can see in this work, this merging of abstraction, and yet with these stylized, simplified African shield forms that run in a band across that bottom half, from shields and masks. So this sort of pan-African idea of these forms. Oliver Lee Jackson was associated with the BAG artists, but his activities were even broader. So he was, at the time, he was teaching at SIUE, and it was a group that was meeting at Catherine Dunham's center in East St. Louis, and it was called the Experiment in Higher Education. And it was sort of an incubator for thinking about Black identity. And it really is one of the sources nationally where the Black studies, right, that's in universities all across the country now. It was sort of an incubator for the Black studies and for comparative studies in that area. So Jackson is studying, he's thinking about this, he brings these Pan-African ideas to the Black artist group. He's probably most well known for a production, a multimedia production. And I should say the Black Artist Group were creating, they would create things on the streets, in community buildings, at universities. They were sort of raucous events. They brought all sorts of people from local communities to, more philosophical thinkers, to artists, jazz aficionados, to really incorporate that local community into this sort of pretty high-end avant-garde thinking. So Jackson creates what he calls, it's called Images, Sons/Ancestors. And it is what he calls a concert ritual prayer. It is performed in 1971 in Powell Auditorium, partially to push against the exclusion of African-derived music and forms in such a sort of bastion of culture as Powell Hall. They begin to perform it. There is a bomb threat. They all leave, everyone, the audience, the performers, they clear the building, and they actually come back and finish the performance because he felt this was so important to perform. And then one of the other last community groups that we're going to look at is this circle of artists who are associated with Max Beckmann. And I show you here Max Beckmann Beckmann's work, The Dream, which is in the exhibition. So this work was actually created before Beckmann comes to St. Louis. So he came to St. Louis in the fall of 1947 to teach at Washington University, and he brings with him this modernist style that for him comes out of both German modernism, but also the experience of World War I and the German culture that comes after World War I, his sort of jaded look at the successes or the failures really of that culture. His style, everything's very angular. All of these figures are crowded to the surface. They're sort of smushed between the picture plane and that wall, that solid wall that kind of pushes them up against that. You know, there isn't even enough room. There's the gentleman sort of at the top on the right. He's trying to climb up that ladder, but the ladder sort of flips out on him. And the woman who's sort of fallen at the bottom there, sort of possibly a drunken woman or a woman who's sort of in a trance or is unconscious, has been pushed against the bottom there. This is an indictment of World War I, and I think we can realize that when the dream is actually in the composition called a Sacra Conversazione, which was a traditional Renaissance form that looked at this basically a sacred conversation, right? So the Madonna and Child are always at the center. Various saints might be gathered around her, and it was an image of adulation, right, and of sort of the stories and the sainthoods and the things in which these saints do to honor the Christian religion. And so it's almost, you know, Beckmann is using this form, but as a kind of satire. So the Madonna and Child figure in the middle is a girl, and she's holding a Puccinella. And Puccinella were clown performances that were on the street, but they were known for their violence, really. They're sort of edgy kind of violence and sort of disturbing violence. The gentleman who I pointed out climbing up the ladder is holding a fish, and for Beckmann, the fish was a symbol of the soul. And you notice he's reaching up at the top, but there is no way for that soul to come out of the room in which it's been contained, out of the world, this worldliness and the follies of it. And you know, that gentleman there's two amputees. He has lost his hands, and then the gentleman down sort of along the floor has had his legs amputated. So the ravages of World War I, and yet the inability and the follies of that world to sort of make a home and to make a rational world for them. So it is this part that influences artists in St. Louis. Now, Beckmann comes to St. Louis in order to replace Philip Guston, who's been teaching at Washington University, and he's going on sabbatical. So it isn't that Beckmann, while he was here, influenced Guston or Green. On the other hand, what it is that Guston had seen the series of paintings about World War I to which The Dream belongs. We don't know if he saw The Dream or not, but he had seen them on display in New York City in the 30s, and they were incredibly powerful and had an impact to him. So he was teaching at Washington University, and then he brought a former student of his, Stephen Green, to Washington University to teach as well. And so in the late 40s, following World War II, which is another sort of worldwide sort of war that had these ravages and was visible and disturbing in its images, Guston and Green were seeing at the end of the war, we're seeing the images of the Holocaust that were coming out more readily to an American population. And they were really struggling with how to respond to it visually. And so they really draw on Beckmann. You can see that in the angular forms, in the way in which both these compositions are pressed up against the surface, but also in the biting indictment of war. So Guston, you see these figures that seem to be locked behind bars of that wood, right? And we think of the images of the Holocaust that came out, or Green's images where the figures are sort of entwined around those ladders. Green did 16 paintings based on the life of Christ, not as an interest in Christ, but as Christ as a figure of the modern world and the issues and problems and violence really of the modern world. But Beckmann also had a influence on artists who were here, and I think we see that in Fred Conway, whose work is not about a political commentary. In fact, this was done on commission for the Scruggs Vandervoort Barney department store. But you do see the pressing of the different parts of Conway's composition, the sort of acidy sort of tones. This, in fact, is a depiction of the corner of, or the intersection of Grand and Olive, which is still to this day in the theater district. And so you can see the Fox Theater light sort of up in that middle, up to the top. You see a number of different theaters that are still in existence. And then also down, I bring a picture of Beckmann's portrait of Fred Conway. They became very close, not only as artists, but also as friends. And then also, Beckmann just influenced a whole group of regional artists. And you see here him having, he's looking at the artist's portrait of Morton May, and May was a very strong collector, and he's one of the reasons why there's so many Beckmanns still in the city. As I said, I also wanted to look at folk art. And so what we see here are artists who work outside of trained communities like that. So Julius Hassenritter was working in Hermann, Missouri, from a German family. His family did have woodworking skills. They were cabinet makers, but Julius goes on to become a jeweler. And so he starts to create these incredible cabinets really as a folk art on his own. And I should tell you that there's such an interest in all this filigree is because this follows the invention of the jigsaw. And so all these artists are very, interested in creating patterns that now suddenly you can in the jigsaw. It also follows the invention of sort of a cross between what we might call like a paperboard or a particle board and plywood. And so it is able to withstand a jigsaw and hold its own and can be lacquered. But you see every single element, every single part of this cabinet has been decorated and covered, and there's little things that dangle and they move and they catch the light. I mean, it's just sort of this crazy vision. And here you see him with many works that he created like this. And in fact, this is one way in which we identified or sort of confirmed that this artist was Julius Hassenritter, was from this photograph that Amy and Beth Rubin, our research assistant who also worked on the show, and I saw when we were in Hermann. We saw this and we went, oh my gosh, like this photograph, and we connected the two together. Or Fred Myers, who never thought of himself as an artist. He was a coal miner, and he always thought of himself that way. But he saw another miner working on creating a puzzle piece, carving it. And so he began carving wood. He brought home a railroad tie from the mine, and that's what he created his Lincoln out of. No tools. You see him on the right there with some of his sculpture. And you also see this Last Stand sculpture, which is not finished. So you see how he works. He has a very simple blade, not the fancy sculpting equipment. And he would polish his objects. You see the high shine on Lincoln with shards of glass, which is also how many folk artists polish because they don't have the money to afford sandpaper and other things. But the incredible movement of this Lincoln and, the sense of the grain, right? He hasn't been trained like Catlett or Houston Chandler, but he still just instinctively understands this. Or Fritz Baurichter. And I should say the reason why we have so many wood pieces is because wood was available and easy to carve. And so artists, it was a ready material for folk artists. So Baurichter had gone to the World's Fair, saw sculpture and thought, I could probably do that. He was a farmer in Warren County. He did carve gun stock, so he had some carving, but he begins carving these animals for friends and for family. But again, very simple. But when you look at this hummingbird, it's so simple and so small, and yet that beautiful arc that goes from tail to beak and the uplifted wings that sort of pull that arc that's going down sort of up. It's a really sophisticated sense of design. And the way the hummingbird just sort of turns his head, I always say he's very bird-like. But the observation, the natural observation in this as well is just really remarkable. And then this whole category, one of the things that we want people who walk through is to make these connections, is to look at what I would call a horror vacui, or a fear of leaving just some open space between Robineau and Hassenritter, the gold medal of American ceramics, and a local folk carver. Or the sense of humanity and observation that both happens in Rothstein, right, one of the top American photographers, in the way in which that boy folds into himself and just the boyness of it. And I think of that in the same way that the hummingbird has been so carefully and simply observed. Or even here, where Fred Myers, the twist and the torsion of his body, the angularity of the way that coat on the right comes. I wish I could point this to you. The way that coat comes up with his arm lifted. And I think of the ladder, the way in which it works compositionally in the Beckmann too. And yet the roundedness of Meyer in comparison to the sharp angularity, the richness of the Meyer to the acidity, the love of Meyer for the Illinois president in some sense, and the respect and the sort of folkloric, idolization of him with the sort of satire and sense of indictment in the Beckmann. So that's my talk. Oh gosh, good. I ended right when I was supposed to. So I am totally open for answering questions.
Great, well, thank you. So we have a couple of questions. I did actually, before we get to those, I wondered, of all of the groups that you've talked about today, which was there one that you were most excited is the wrong word, but learn more about, that maybe we didn't know so much about, but we learned because of this exhibition, or
Oh
that
goodness.
one that you'd like to learn more about?
Yes, absolutely. And so the University City Potteries and the St. Genevieve Art School and the FSA programs, all the WPA programs and Beckmann, right? Those are well known, and we wanted to do this. We wanted to look at national, regional, local, and mix them all together. I mean, St. Genevieve probably isn't known nationally, but it's certainly well known regionally. I would have to say probably the People's Art Center, which there's plenty of archives on. It's just not something that people have done a lot of work looking through and looking at the artists and the kinds of opportunities and those local artists who show up on their classes, like the registers of who's enrolled in classes and in exhibitions, and then just digging them up, because they're not people well known even to this local art community. So that was great. And then I think some of the folk artists like Fred Myers, he's not a complete surprise to people at the University of Illinois at Carbondale, because on the WPA he carved dinosaurs for the museum, which he did not particularly like. He didn't like having to do something on time, being that kind of artist, but they're on display there. But certainly outside of that, and the Lincoln, and so finding these things that maybe the institution that held them knew well, but not really at all outside of that, and the quality of them. I mean, the quality of the production of these artists is just, it was just a treat to find.
Yeah, great, thank you. So someone has asked, so regarding your comments about Beckmann and his colleagues, could you speak to the influences that Slam's director at that time might have had on his body of work? So the director, Perry Rathbone.
Yeah. So Rathbone, actually, so Guston was a big proponent of bringing Beckmann here. Beckmann was in exile in Europe at the time. So it is this job that brought him to the United States. So Guston knew of his work, and so he was lobbying for him. But Perry Rathbone also knew Beckmann's work and respected him highly. And in fact, it was Beckmann then who goes to Washington University and talks. And it's also, I think I've got this right, Rathbone who travels and talks to Beckmann to say, come here and work. And it's also Rathbone who introduces Beckmann not just to art circles, but to collector circles. I mean, and Beckmann talks about like how fabulous this world is in St. Louis. And he has his first solo, big museum exhibition in the United States here. He makes a much larger national reputation here. And he has major patronage even after he lives here. And he passes away very, very soon after he leaves St. Louis. But that's why we have the largest collection of Max Beckmann works here, is because of Rathbone and that community of collectors. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah. Let's see. So this is specifically about the Bernard Peters landscape. And someone was wondering if you know if he was influenced by Van Gogh? The painting
Ah,
reminds the viewer of Van Gogh.
I don't know that. I would be surprised if he wasn't. He was trained and he was teaching art, so it would be surprising to me if he hadn't. And the impasto is very like Van Gogh. I hadn't thought of it. The palette may be slightly different, but I would. He has to have known Van Gogh. Whether or not that was a primary influence on him, I'm afraid I don't know. It would take a little more research, which would be fun, right?
Right, great. Right, well, wonderful. I think that's all the questions that we have. So thank you, Melissa. This has been wonderful. And as you mentioned earlier, the last program in this series is going to happen next week on Thursday, November 11th, and will feature your co-curator, Amy Torbert, who will focus on the thematic section titled Art as Advocate. And then also, if people are interested, I encourage you to register to join us tomorrow, November 5th at noon, to hear SIUE Professor of Cultural Anthropology, Corey Wilmot, discuss the symbolism in the geometric patterns woven into textiles seen in the exhibition Woodlands, Native American Art from St. Louis Collections, which is now also on view at the museum. So I encourage you to register for those programs and more at slam.org/events. And thanks a lot, Melissa, and hope everyone
Thank
has a great
you.
day.
Absolutely. Thank you.